Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you, Rabbi Yosie Levine, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast. Welcome to the Judaism Demystified podcast. Before we begin, I'd usually like to ask our guests a little bit about yourself, tell us a little about your background, and also what drew you to writing the book on Hakham Tsevi.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. So I grew up in Los Angeles. I've been living in the New York area for the better part of the last 30 years. I did my undergrad at Columbia, Smicha at Yeshiva University, and my PhD at the Barnard Revel Graduate School. By day, I'm a rabbi. I work at a shul here on the Upper West Side called the Jewish Center. I've been here for about the past 20 years or so. And on the side, I like to dabble in academia. So my area is early modern European Jewish history. And I took an interest early on in my scholarly studies in Hakham Tsevi Ashkenazi. So maybe I'll just do a quick bio of Hakham Tsevi to kind of orient the listeners and let everyone know sort of when and where we are. Hakham Tsevi Ashkenazi was born in Moravia, we think in around 1658. And he's coming of age in a very kind of fraught time. So you'll know that this is right in the aftermath of the Chmielnicki massacres, 1648, 1649. And Shabtai Tzvi shows up on the scene and announces that he's Mashiach in 1665. He apostatizes in 1666 and dies in 1676. So that story is looming large in the early years of Hakham Tsevi. You think about what it means to be a kid, right, when this story is unfolding. So Hakham Tsevi is a little bit of a mystery. He comes from Ashkenazic stock. He has deep roots in Ashkenaz. And probably because so many of the centers of Ashkenazic learning were decimated over the course of the 30 Years' War and the Chmielnicki massacres, and so many Ashkenazic Jews were refugees, were dislocated. So his parents actually sent him to train and to learn in yeshivos in the Ottoman Empire, in Salonika, in Constantinople. And he becomes quite expert in Sephardic culture, in Sephardic halakha, and we're happy to return to that issue later on if it's of interest. He marries. He's living in present-day Budapest in the 1680s, and in 1686 there's a tragedy for his family and a life-altering event for the Jews of Budapest. Budapest had been in control of the Ottomans for many years, and now the Habsburg Empire attacks. There's a siege, the siege of Budapest, and the Jewish community is in shambles as a result. And it's really the last time for some period that there's a normative Jewish community in Budapest. Jews are taken captive, including Hakham Tsevi's parents. Tragically, his wife and young daughter are killed in that siege, and Hakham Tsevi has to flee. He miraculously survives and makes it out as a refugee. He spends a little time in Sarajevo, ministering to a Sephardic community, and then spends really the next 20 or so years in the triple community of Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek. He marries the daughter-in-law of the chief rabbi, and the daughter of the chief rabbi, rather, becomes the son-in-law of the chief rabbi, and builds a family. And he's learning in a private kollel. It's called a klois. He takes on a little bit more of an official position after his father-in-law passes away. It's a quiet time in his life, 1690 to about 1710. He's learning, studying, teaching, writing, and he becomes known as an important halakhic figure. And a lot of the material that we have from Hakham Tsevi's career and his rabbinic career date from this time period. He's writing Teshuvos, he's writing response to communities all over Europe. 1710, he's called to Amsterdam, and he becomes the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Amsterdam. There's a very prominent Sephardic community in Amsterdam at the time, and a growing Ashkenazic community. He's only in that position for a short amount of time, 3-4 years. In 1714, we could talk about why. He's basically forced to leave Amsterdam, and he never holds much of a rabbinic position after that. He's in Poland for a few years, and at the very end of his life in 1718, for just a few months, he becomes the chief rabbi of Lemberg, the community of Lvov, and he dies in 1718. So to answer your question and what drew me to Hakham Tsevi, I'd say a couple things. One is he's kind of a mystery of a guy, right? Who's this Ashkenazi guy? He has a Sephardic name. Why can't he hold down a position in a community for very long? His Teshuvos, if you read his Teshuvos, he speaks with such independence and such confidence, and it's a very kind of rare combination to have someone who's both like a top tier posek and top tier Talmid Chacham that everybody knows in the base medrash, and is known among scholars as being a very important person for the kind of political controversies in which he was involved. So, who's this man? Can we unpack the story here? Can we solve the mystery? And I'll just say that controversy makes for good copy. When people lead quiet lives, so there's not often that much to explore and to write about. But when people are always in the middle of a machlokes, so that can be very alluring and sometimes very illuminating.
Yep. No, it's not every day you have someone called Hakham Tsevi Ashkenazi. He was also in your book. You write a lot about all the different political things and that he had to deal with in his Teshuvot. It's like so wide ranging, and we hope that with this podcast, people will get the book and read more about it. Before we get into the in depth into the Hakham Tsevi, your book is not only about Hakham Tsevi. Your book also offers a comprehensive study of the early modern rabbinic period, going beyond a simple biography. By analyzing the Teshuvot of that era, you provide valuable insights into Jewish life and its rabbinic context. Can you elaborate on the significance of Teshuvot in shaping our historical Jewish consciousness beyond their halakhic importance?
Yeah, so historians, particularly in the 20th century, maybe most notably Yaakov Katz, were of the mind that Teshuvos really provide a very important window onto their historic contexts. And not every Teshuva is a window onto historic context. But sometimes you can really find your way in to intellectual history and cultural history and political history through Teshuvos. And I'm very taken by this line of thought. And it was sort of my working assumption as I worked on this project. It was sort of my working assumption that when you're looking at a tshuva, you're really only looking at one small aspect of a larger story, even in the simplest case of a tshuva. So what are you seeing? Did you see the question? Sometimes it's recorded. Sometimes it's recorded in an edited way. Sometimes it's not recorded at all. You see the answer. And then, well, what happens after that? How was the answer received? Did anyone implement the answer? Did it start a controversy? Was it the beginning of a further exchange? And the deeper and deeper I dug, the more often I found that very, very often, one tshuva was actually just one node in a much, much larger conversation. And part of my hope, part of my fantasy, is that I could sort of make this revelation known to just the average folks in the Beis Medrash who are learning Shilos and Teshuvos without a lot of sensitivity to this reality, right? This notion that you have one page in front of you, you have this amazing tshuva, but there's a whole story, and you're just getting one chapter of it. And what if we could try to fill in the blanks and know what the questioner looked like, what they were thinking, what their lives were like, what their context was about, what the relationship to the rabbi was that they were writing to? How did they choose to write to this rabbi? What did the rabbi do when he got the question? Did he consult? Did he start asking other people? There's one case I found that I referenced just quickly in the book where a community said explicitly, they asked this question, they sent it into the rabbi, and they said, "We're taking a survey. Please let us know what you think of this issue." So half the time, most of the time, you don't get a formulation like that. But they're telling you this is just one. You're only one part of a much larger story. So my contention is that Teshuvos, in their fullest sense, can be a window onto much larger stories. I'll just give you one example because I was just looking at this recently. There's a case from it's like 17th, 18th century, I think, in Worms, and there was a question of how do you daven Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos? So what's the question? The question is who lights the candle and when? Okay, so it's a catch-22. So if Shabbos is not over yet, and you haven't davened Ma'ariv and you haven't said Havdalah, then you really shouldn't be lighting a candle. Shabbos isn't over yet. But you have to just go back and remember that if there were no candles burning from before Shabbos, then it's dark outside and there's no light to daven Ma'ariv. So, and maybe have a kid do it, or the shamus says Baruch Hamavdu ben Kodesh L'chol first, then runs ahead and lights it, and then everybody else could stand by the like, who's thinking about, right? So you see the question, but there's a whole world here that we don't think about. How do you daven Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos when you haven't said Havdalah and the shul is pitch black because there's no candles that are lit? So just the most banal example of how the halakhic literature actually opens up these much larger issues.
Fascinating.
Yep. Really amazing. We take it for granted when we're looking at history and just not understanding the complexities of the issues that the rabbis at the time were dealing with. So it really gives us a really nice insight into what was going on. So one fascinating aspect of your book is this portrayal of Jewish communities during that period and their relationship with rabbinic positions. What are some intriguing dynamics you observed regarding the political and cultural forces within these communities? And how did they impact Hakham Tsevi's relationship with his congregation?
So it's a great question, and one of kinds of the key components that distinguishes the early modern period from the medieval period is what scholars refer to as the professionalization of the rabbinate. So I should say, just sort of in passing, that one of the things that draws me to the early modern period is I actually started out with a stronger interest in medieval Jewish history, but you're so limited in medieval Jewish history because there's just so many limitations on the sources that we have available. So that's a embedded challenge for anyone interested in medieval Jewish history. Take, for example, Rashi. So we don't know too much about Rashi's rabbinate, but I can tell you that Rashi was not answerable to a board. And if somebody asked Rashi a question, he felt completely free to give the answer that he thought was the right answer. And like, he's the final authority. He's Rashi. You get to the early modern period, and the rabbis are now salaried employees of the community. And it's not so different from the 21st century.
Really not.
Rabbis have to look over their shoulder, and wonder, how is my answer, how is my statement, how is my sermon going to be received? And if it's not received well, I might be out of a job. And if I'm out of a job, I might be out of a house because I'm living in a house that's owned by the community. And then what's my family going to eat? And where are we going to go? And so you start to see the tensions between lay boards, lay leaders on the one hand, and rabbis on the other. So we don't have a book on this because it would be a very dry book. But we have dozens and dozens of rabbinic contracts from the early modern period. I think they're fascinating because they tell us what the priorities are for the parties involved. And the community says it's very important for us that the rabbi preach this number of times a year. And the rabbi says it's very important for me that the local base medrash be filled with Sefaradim and Talmidim. Right? So we get a sense of what's important to the community and what's important to the rabbis. So a number of scholars have pointed this out. Again, coming back to Yaakov Katz, he says, by and large, the boards and the rabbis work nicely together, and they figured out their respective areas of authority. They respected those areas of authority, and it worked out as a partnership. Where it gets interesting and where we hear about it is when it stops working out, okay? And the lay leaders say, oh no, you don't have authority to do that. That's our turf. Or the rabbi says, stop right there. You can't do that. I'm drawing the line right here. I'm the final authority. And then there's tension, then there's controversy, and sometimes then there are fireworks. And if you're a Hakham Tsevi and you're relatively uncompromising and you're relatively confident about your positions and you really believe what you believe and you're of a mind that says, take it or leave it, let the chips fall where they may, so that can make for difficult relationships between the rabbi and the community.
This was such a fascinating part of your book. I really, really enjoyed it. It is, like you said, it's almost like you feel that everything they were going through then is like mirrored today in so many ways. And it was very powerful how you made the point that Hakham Tsevi was, he was uncompromising. He compromised a bit, but meaning to certain things, like he was his way or the highway, and he had difficult relationships because of that with the shuls. It's a fascinating chapter in the book, and I highly suggest that people should look into it. It's incredible. Yeah.
All right. You want to take the next question?
Sure. Okay. So a pivotal chapter in your book explores Hakham Tsevi's connection with the Sefaradim and his defense of certain Sepharadi attitudes towards Jewish law and minhagim. Can you provide more insight into this aspect of his life and work?
Sure. So maybe let me just back up and provide just a drop of historic context. And again, thinking about some of the differences between the medieval world. Again, these aren't hard and fast rules, but the medieval world on the one hand and the early modern world on the other. So, if you're an Ashkenazic Jew living in France in the 13th century, how much interaction do you have with Sephardic Jews in your lifetime? So maybe France is a bad example. You go over the Pyrenees and you could get to Spain. But the further away that you get between these communities, the distances are important, and it's hard to traverse them. And Ashkenaz is Ashkenaz, and Sfarad is Sfarad. One of the kind of defining qualities of the early modern period is this sense of mobility. Everyone and everything is on the move. So where do you even begin the early modern period? Most scholars would tell you, 1492, 1497, 1500. We're talking about a time in the aftermath of the dislocation, the expulsion of the world's most populous Jewish community. So all of Sfarad is on the move. And then you start talking about what's going on in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the Ashkenazic communities are being expelled and dislocated, and there's a massacre, and there's a pogrom, and they have to run, and they're everywhere. So what starts to happen, certainly with much more frequency than ever happened in the medieval period, is that you start to have locations where you have Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities living side by side. So in Venice and in Hamburg and in London and in Amsterdam, right on down this list, you have Ashkenazic communities and Sephardic communities. And they're right there. They're living in the same city. So there's a kind of open question. Okay, now we got it. The Sephardic community, what was the interaction like? Did they talk to each other? Did they marry each other? Did they patronize the same butcher shops? Like, what was the relationship? What was it like? And this is a complex question, and the different answers for different moments and for different communities. But as a general matter, the Sephardic community tended to put up walls. Like, don't try to you Ashkenazim, don't try to come into our community. Often, we're here first. You take the case of Amsterdam, which is an important example. So the Sefaradim got there first. There all kinds of family connections and business connections based on the Iberian expulsions. They're very successful in commerce. They make it big. They establish themselves, and then the Ashkenazim come in as refugees, penniless, and they're like in totally different worlds. So in some communities, the Sephardic community would say, there's a ban. You're not allowed. No member of our community is allowed to, and then fill in the blank. Not allowed to marry an Ashkenazic Jew. Not allowed to, patronize their community shops. Not allowed to adjudicate a case in front of a court that's not a Sephardic court. Right? All kinds of examples of rules that separate Ashkenaz from Sfarad. So I would say, as a general matter, the cultural borders are quite entrenched. They're not rock solid, and sometimes there is some integration, but very important cultural boundaries. At the same time, I think there's a strong case to be made that the intellectual boundaries are much less porous. Okay, what I mean by that, at the very least, is you have printed books in the early modern period. They're all over. Paper is much less expensive. Books become much more affordable, and you can have Ashkenazim studying Sephardic texts, and you can have Sephardim studying Ashkenazic texts, and there's intellectual exchange. And then inevitably, what happens is, well, I'm an Ashkenazi living in it. I could write a letter to a Sephardic rabbi in another community, and then there starts to be an exchange of ideas. So zooming back into Hakham Tsevi. So Hakham Tsevi was quite exceptional. because it tended to be that Ashkenazim sent their kids to Ashkenazic yeshivas, and Sephardic kids sent their kids to Sephardic families sent their kids to Sephardic yeshivas, and their training was quite different. Their experience was quite different. Their cultural milieus were quite different. But Hakham Tsevi had this extraordinary background where he really lived and was integrated into Sephardic culture for the first couple decades of his life. And so much so that he adopted the name Hakham Tsevi, which is quite unusual. There's not really another parallel. There's no other Ashkenazic posek, in the early modern period until Hakham Bernays in the 19th century, who goes by this title Hakham. And it becomes a real point of differentiation for Hakham Tsevi. His son Yaakov Emden even writes that when he came to Amsterdam, the Sefaradim adopted him, and they treated him like one of their own, and they asked him their questions. So Hakham Tsevi actually was a kind of unique figure in that he was able to bridge these two worlds. Now, were there practical consequences? So there's a short list of practical consequences in his own, nusach hatfilah. There were aspects of the Sephardic nusach that he integrated. The sort of most famous, almost example is kitnios. Right? So Ashkenazim don't eat kitnios on Pesach, and Hakham Tsevi didn't say because of my exposure to the Sephardic world, but it is conspicuous that the most vociferous advocate for the abolition of kitnios in the Ashkenazic world was Hakham Tsevi. He says it didn't work. He says, if I had my way, I would have abolished the whole thing. But for whatever reason, his attempts to abolish kitnios were not successful. But you get the impression, would someone who hadn't spent all those years in Sephardic communities have come to the same conclusion? I'm not sure.
I think if I remember correctly in your book, the main point of contention, or maybe not contention, but the main point was that Ashkenazim seem to hold minhagim to almost a halakhic level, if I'm remembering correctly what you were saying in the book. So they hold minhagim to be basically at the level of halakha, whereas the Sefaradim did not. And Hakham Tsevi, when it came to minhagim, he kind of aligned himself more with Sefaradim in that if the minhag is not rooted in an actual halachically viable source, he wasn't gonna go with it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, I think there's really a lot to explore with respect to the orientations of a minhag between and among the Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And what I try to do in the book is make some kind of contemporary comparisons. Here's an Ashkenazic list, a classic Ashkenazic posek, the Chavos Yair. And, he's 100 examples in the Chavos Yair where there's a minhag. And he says, I'm not really sure, but we should do it anyway because it's a minhag. And Hakham Tsevi says, it's a minhag, and it's actually not a good minhag, so we should probably do away with the minhag. And there are a number of times where he, unlike kitnios, where he sort of isn't able to carry it out to its conclusion, there are a number of cases where Hakham Tsevi actually says, no, that minhag's not really well established. It's not well attested. It wasn't rabbinically mandated. We should, do away with the minhag.
Okay. All right. So you just mentioned Rav Yaakov Emden as his son, who's probably more well known, especially about his positions on Kabbala. But I'm interested in knowing how Hakham Tsevi related to Kabbala, and in what ways does his attitude towards Kabbala manifest in his Teshuvot?
Yeah, so that's a really big and important question, and I'll back up to say, and obviously part of a much larger conversation. I'm sure you've dealt with it on other episodes of your podcast. But what's the authority of the Zohar. How do we understand the authorship of the Zohar? So Rabbi Yaakov Emden, for instance, has a whole book on the antiquity of the Zohar and how he makes a very strong case that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was not, in fact, the author of the Zohar. That doesn't mean the Zohar is not important. It just means that it's written at a date much later than some authorities claim. So we have no evidence. I just say that by way of comparison. We have no evidence that Hakham Tsevi was of that mind. Right? I have every reason to believe that Hakham Tsevi, like many of his contemporaries, believed that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was the author of the Zohar. That being said, he had a very important argument against the popularization of the Zohar. And a lot of this we have to speculate, but probably comes back to Sabbateanism, and again part of a larger topic. But there was a strong sense, and again, remember, it's decades old. The story of Sabbateanism is 1666. By the time we're talking about Hakham Tsevi and his adulthood in 1700, 1710, so the story is from a while ago, and yet the story is still live. It's still an important story because there's a whole group, and we don't know how widespread it is, but there's a whole group of crypto-Sabbatians who have gone underground, but still very much believe that Shabtai Tzvi is the Messiah. And I say this by way of background because so much of what fueled the fire of the Sabbatian movement was this attachment to Kabbala. And there was this sense among Hakham Tsevi and some of his contemporaries that it was time to sort of put the lid back on Kabbala. In some sense, it was impossible. The genie was out of the bottle, and in an age of print, like you can't control the press. That being said, you could control what you could control. So, and again, I tried to do this by way of comparison. There are contemporaries of Hakham Tsevi who are just not really concerned about this issue, and they quote Kabbalah right and left in halakhic discussions, and here's what the Shulchan Aruch says, here's what the Zohar says, and here's my conclusion. And Hakham Tsevi, even though he was quite knowledgeable, we have lots of evidence that he was quite knowledgeable about Kabbalah, and as a personal matter, if you asked him, he would say that Kabbalah is very important and factored into a lot of his life and a lot of his thinking. That being said, when it came to his published works, he really tried to limit the extent to which Kabbalah made it to the fore. And one tshuva in particular, he's quite explicit about the sense that he's like, you guys, there was a question that came up just to put it in more specific context. Somebody wrote to him and said, there's this debate. What do you do when you get to shul late? Should you start from the beginning like the Zohar says, or should you do like catch up and try to get to Shemona Esrei by the time everyone is davening Shemona Esrei, so you get Tefillah B'tzibur? And he sort of starts off by saying, like, that's not what the Zohar meant in the first place. And like you guys who are asking me this question, like, stop spending your time trying to learn the Zohar. Like, we should be sticking to the traditional sources. That's how we should orient. That's how we should orient ourselves, and that's how we should paskin halacha. So I argue that this stance, the sense that like we're trying to tamp it down, we're trying to put it back in its place. We're worried about it being misread. We're worrying about it being misused. That orientation kind of anticipates the stance of later 18th century rabbis who came along and said, something very similar, which is let's try to keep Kabbalah within the province of the initiated and keep it out of the hands of the masses. I know that was a lot.
No, that's 1 second. Sorry, do you hear me? I think I lost connection for a sec. Yeah, so I mean, I think what's interesting is that one generation removed from that, or his son's generation, you have a situation where you mentioned that there were these crypto Sabbateans, or people accused of it, like Rav Yonatan Eibeshitz, the whole controversy with Rav Yaakov Emden. I wonder what happened between from his father's generation to his generation, where he felt the need to be more kind of explosive in his response, I guess, towards Kabbalah, even though they were like kind of one, it was one generation further from the Sabbatean controversy. I'm just wondering if there's like any answer to that.
So I'm not sure there is an answer to that. I think part of the answer comes back to something we were talking about a little earlier, which is just what is the authority of the rabbis. So you can scream till you're blue in the face that we should be doing X, Y, or Z. Is anybody listening? So are there, if Hakham Tsevi had his way, I don't think we would find, Kabbalistic books being printed in the 17 teens and the 1720s, but they are being printed, right? Because he's one person in one community with one audience, and there's printing presses and other authorities and people with other interests who maybe never heard of Hakham Tsevi, or even if they have heard of him, don't feel obliged to be beholden to his opinion.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the genie's out of the bottle or the cat's out of the bag. It's impossible to put it back in. So at a certain point, you just got to accept reality. Like this is what we have to deal with. So it's very, very interesting what takes place here. So and Bensi, you had one last question before
Before
we.
that last question, there was something I remembered as you were talking about this from the book, regarding how Mishnah. You spoke in the book about Mishnah and how the printing press kind of brought the consciousness of Mishnah back to that time period. Is it okay if off the cuff I can ask you to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is a big topic which actually has not been explored deeply. And part of my hope was that my dream is that I would spark more interest in this topic and people could explore it further. But there is a sense, and scholars have written about this a little. There's a book called The Mishnaic Moment, which is actually more interested in the Christian interest in the Mishnah, but it's a good title. And there is a sense that in the early modern period, Mishnah is undergoing a renaissance. Now, Mishnah was always being learned, right? I don't mean to say before the early modern period, but Jews weren't. They were learning the Mishnah. It's just that by and large, they were learning the Mishnah within the context of the Gemara and the context of the Talmudic tradition. In the early modern period, we get an explosion of interest in Mishnah qua Mishnah. So Mishnah commentaries are booming. The printing of the Mishnah is booming. There's an explosion of Mishnayos study groups. So Kabbalists are very interested in the study of Mishnah. There's chevras, like we don't have too many chevras anymore. We had like the Chevra Kadisha as like our last chevra. But in the early modern period, there's a million chevras. There was a chevra, Bikur Cholim, and a chevra Shas. So you start to see these chevros Mishnayos everywhere. and this concept we have of learning Mishnayos, Ilui Nishmas, for Shloshim or for a Yortzeit. So that's everywhere in the early modern period. So I argued, and I just did like a case study for one person, for one posek. I argued that Hakham Tsevi, and it's quite surprising if you're not sensitive to this issue, but if you go back to his Teshuvos, he mentions the Mishnah in like almost half of his Teshuvos, right? Which is, and I tried to argue, it's like there were times where just quote the Shulchan Aruch and the Shach, like that's what we would expect 18th century posek to be working with. Like, okay, there's the Tur, and there's the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shach, and the Taz, and here's the halakha. He's like, the Mishnah, it's not the Beis Yosef. We're not like going through from the beginning. This is a tshuva. In the tshuva, it's like the last place you would expect. It's like, no. He's like, the Mishnah says, really? We're paskening from them. Like, there's 1,500 years of intervening, halakhic discourse here. Like, no, he's not ignoring the intervening 1,500 years, but like he goes back to the Mishnah. He goes back to the Mishnah very, very often, right? And so my argument, and you could take it or leave it, and again, this is very limited, and I wish people would think about this in the larger context among other poskim of the period. But my argument is that Hakham Tsevi was kind of making a case that the Mishnah really should be the source of our authorities. Like, he just go back to the basics, go back to the Mishnah.
That's why it popped up in my head during the Kabbala segment.
The Kabbala, and we were talking about this a little before we went on live. It was like people are so interested in, I'm a historian, so I'm not going to talk about 2026, but Neo Hasidus, and it's like, it's a posik. Oh, okay, this is beautiful, and I'm sure there's so much there, and let's learn a Mishnah.
He's peeling the onion back. He wants everyone to get back to the fundamentals, basically. That's like a subtle hint, subtle message.
Back to the fundamentals. And it fits. I'm not saying it's causative, but this is the Renaissance. Like, this is the moment where it's like, let's go back to the most important texts of our Masorah.
So important. And we should take that advice today as well. So important.
Don't get me started, but if I could, if I had my druthers, like, let's learn a pasuk, let's learn a Rashi, like, that's the fundamentals, and then there's plenty of time to learn other things.
It's an amazing insight into the Hakham Tsevi, and we should all learn from it. And end the story with Hakham Tsevi, the Ḥayon Affair. Am I pronouncing that right, by the way?
Yeah, there's some debate about how to pronounce it, but that's perfect.
Okay, so if you can lead us through the Ḥayon Affair and the fallout and everything to do with it.
Because we could do a whole episode on the Ḥayon Affair. So I'm going to do an abridged version, and you tell me if there's pieces here that you want to unpack further. We're happy to. Okay, so just to set the stage, Hakham Tsevi is the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Amsterdam. The year is 1713. There's two communities, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The Sephardic community, which is much older in Amsterdam, much more venerable, much more successful. The chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi, is a man called Shlomo Ayalon. Shlomo Ayalon is actually a querist. He actually has shilas that he asks that are published in Hakham Tsevi. Amsterdam was the print capital of the universe, so people were looking for rabbinic approbation. Sometimes they'd come to Amsterdam, they get a haskama from Hakham Tsevi and from Ashkenazi chief rabbi and from Shlomo Ayalon, the Sephardic chief rabbi. So sometimes you have both of them side by side. 1713, two communities. Hakham Tsevi's Ashkenazi community and Shlomo Ayalon's Sephardic community. And into town walks a man called Nehemiah Ḥayon. We don't know too much about Nehemiah Ḥayon because most of what we know comes from him, and he's not the most credible guy. He has two books that he's interested in promoting that he had published the year before in Berlin. The first book is a book called Divrei Nehemiah. And Divrei Nehemiah is a book on the Parsha. And if you open it up and you read it, it's on HebrewBooks.org. You can Google it. It'll come right up on Hebrew Books. There's a couple pieces there which are a little odd or a little bizarre, a little unconventional, but it's a perfectly kosher book on the Parsha from a guy who's interested in Kabbala and Kabbalistic readings of the Torah. Book number one, Divrei Nehemiah. And he comes with book number two called Oz Lelokim. Okay, and Oz Lelokim is a book of theology and a book of Kabbalah. And both of the books are very well approbated. Okay, we could spend a long time talking about approbations in this period. Just to give a quick thumbnail. So copyrights are just sort of coming into their own. If you publish a book in 1712, and you have to be worried that somebody's going to steal your intellectual property. What's to stop you from taking my book, republishing it, and undercutting me, selling it for a discount? I worked so hard to put it together, and what am I going to do? I have no recourse. The best I could do is get a haskama from a rabbi that says, I hereby declare anybody who republishes a book without permission from the author within the next 3 years, 5 years, whatever the case is, as a cherem, they're going to be banned. We disallow in the strongest possible, could listen or not listen, but that's like the best you could do. Okay, so haskamos functioned as copyrights, and they functioned as endorsements the same way you go to the store. I guess we don't really do that anymore in the 21st century, but in the old days, you go to the bookstore and you look at the back of the book, and maybe I don't know the author, but I know the famous person who endorsed the book, so maybe I'll buy the book because this person says it's the best thing since sliced bread. So what Nehemiah Ḥayon did is he got some of the greatest rabbis of the generation to write approbations to his book Divrei Nehemiah. And if you actually go back and read the approbations to Divrei Nehemiah, it's a fun exercise. You'll see that the approbators say the following. One of the first approbations is from David Oppenheim. David Oppenheim would have been by far and away the most famous rabbi of the generation. He was the chief rabbi of Prague. He was political.
You mention him a few times in the book.
Very important person. If you're interested, there's a wonderful book called Prince the Press by Joshua Teplitsky, Yale University Press. David Oppenheim gives a haskama to the book, and he has this great line. He says, I only read one page of the book, and I really shouldn't give a haskama to a book that I only read one page of, but people speak so highly about the author. I want to help him out. I'm giving a haskama to the book. And then the next haskama is written by another prominent rabbi who says, I was really too busy to read any of the book, but if David Oppenheim says this is a good book, I'm with him. Okay, and you read the next haskama, and he says, this is not my area. I don't really know anything about this topic, but the two previous rabbis are so, I'm with them. So you can imagine where this is going. Nobody actually read the book. They all give haskamas to the book. Nehemiah Ḥayon then takes the haskamas that he received for book number one and cuts and pastes them into book number two.
Wow.
Okay, without the consent of the approbators. It just so happens, to make a long story short, that Nehemiah Ḥayon is a crypto-Sabbatean. And his book, Oz Lelokim, is the very first time that a crypto-Sabbatean had ever authored and published clearly, nakedly Sabbatean book.
Is this book available? Can you find the book somewhere?
HebrewBooks.org. It's available. 2 clicks.
Wow.
Oz Lelokim. Fascinating. I don't know if they've corrected this, but last time I checked, the haskamos don't appear. right? In the copy that they have on HebrewBooks.org. Okay, if you
But
go to the National Library of Israel,
is he explicitly Sabbatean in it, or is he?
yes,
Oh.
explicitly. Okay, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that in a second. So until
Is it like a
1712,
Sabbatean theology book?
yeah.
Okay.
So Sabbatians had published books, but like they did it in a very, kind of clever way, and there'd just be a coded reference here or there. This is like overflowing with what any normal reader would consider to be kind of heresy. So he shows up with his books. There's a man called Moshe Chagiz, who's a good friend of Hakham Tsevi. He's actually a rabbi who had spent time in Italy. He was from Israel. He doesn't have a position in the community. He's a traveler. He's a shadar. He's raising money for the Jews of Palestine. He publishes a lot of books on his own. He's also a massive Talmud Chacham. He gets a hold of the book and he says, there's something a little fishy about this. He gives the book to Hakham Tsevi. And Hakham Tsevi picks up Yosie Levine. He's like, this is a problem. There's Sabbatian heresy on every page of this book.
Crazy.
And he, again, to make a long story short, he knocks on the door of the Sephardic community and says, you have to kick this guy out of the community, and you have to put out a cherem against the book. And the Sefaradim, basically say, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, but you are the Ashkenazic rabbi, and we are the Sephardic community. And what authority do you think you possibly have to issue any cherem for our community? So Hakham Tsevi stands by his cherem. He says, you got to kick the guy out of the community. You have to burn the book. The Sefaradim say, we're going to take it under advisement. Nobody should say anything about the book. We're going to have a commission of inquiry. Shlomo Ayalon, chief rabbi of the Sephardic community, is going to head a 7-person commission. He appoints 6 co-commissioners to investigate the book. Hakham Tsevi, thank you for investigating the book. I'm issuing another cherem against anyone who reads the book, and you can't keep the guy, and you can't keep the book. The Sefaradim go through this process of investigating the book, and they come to their conclusion and announce to the community, we have investigated the book. The book is a kosher book. There's no heresy in the book.
No way.
As it turns out, Shlomo Ayalon was himself a crypto-Sabbatian. So it was unsurprising that he and his commission would declare that the book was totally kosher. Hakham Tsevi and Moshe Chagiz try to sound the alarm bell. The authorities of Amsterdam get involved, and at the end of the day, the Sephardim basically place a cherem against Hakham Tsevi and Moshe Chagiz, and they are forced to leave Amsterdam under very unfortunate circumstances. And
wow.
As I mentioned, Hakham Tsevi, that's it. He spends the next 3-4 years wandering, and never has a position like that again.
Wow.
The position in Amsterdam was like one of the most prominent positions in Europe, and he lost it like that because he was unwilling to kowtow to lay authorities that he thought were dead wrong about this particular issue.
It's kind of unfortunate how this Sabbatean story kind of was brushed under the rug, because we take for granted, or we just don't, people just don't know like how widespread this was among leaders. It's crazy, and it's an important lesson, because a lot of people have the kind of, let's say, the Das Torah approach, like, oh, it's impossible for our leaders to ever make mistakes. This is like very recent, and it's extremely like impactful for generations. So I think that it's something that actually, I think the Sabbatean controversy is such an important topic that it should be spoken about.
And it kept coming back. I mean, there was another iteration in 1725, and then you have, of course, the Emden Eibeshitz controversy, and then you have the next generation of the Frankists. Like, it was not going away. it was not going away.
Wow.
I'll just add one footnote, which is, one of the big takeaways from the Ḥayon Affair is the sense that rabbis didn't have to go it alone. There's a piece of the story, just for the sake of time, that I omitted. Hakham Tsevi could not believe that any of these rabbis actually wrote approbations for this book. So he took out his quill and he wrote to them, and he said, "I have a copy of Oz Le'Elokim, written by Nehemiah Ḥayon. Have you seen this book? Did you write a haskama to this book? Do you think this book is actually not heretical?" And they all wrote back and said, "Haskama to Oz? Never heard of it. Never wrote it. If I wrote it, it was a mistake. There's like a yeshiva in Venice that I was it's like haskama. Our community doesn't write haskamas." Right? So he actually created a coalition of like-minded rabbis, and he collected all of these letters and all of these signatories to be able to say, "I am not alone in believing that." Right? These are my compatriots. These are my colleagues. They've all signed on with me in this effort to discredit this Sabbatian, and that became an important modus operandi for rabbis in the early modern period. Again, it didn't start in the Ḥayon Affair, but it took on new energy in the Ḥayon Affair. This sense, like, I don't have to go it alone. We could form a coalition, and together, like a unified rabbinate, could actually make a very strong case. And that became very important for controversies that would follow throughout the rest of the 18th, 19th century.
What a crazy story.
So
Really
shocking.
amazing.
That's
it's really insane how that could happen. Wow.
Available on Amazon.com.
Well, Rabbi, this was amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. And before we go, do you have anything besides this book on Hakham Tsevi, do you have anything else you'd like to plug, or where people can find you also?
Well, I work at a shul on the Upper West Side called the Jewish Center. Everyone's invited to join us anytime. We always have wonderful activities, programs, and classes, both on Shabbos and throughout the week. And my next project I'm working on, actually a group of 5 European rabbis who emigrated to the United States at the end of the 19th century. So I'm in a little bit of a different time period away, but I'm at the beginning stages of that project. So we have a little time before there's another book to plug.
And when that time comes, we'd love to have you on again to discuss.
For sure.
If I live that long, it would be my honor.
Thank you so much for coming on. The Hakham Tsevi. We need more Hakham Tsevis in today's world as well. We need more Hakham Tsevis. He was a very unique character, and we appreciate so much your efforts to spread the life and the authenticity of the Hakham Tsevi, and best of luck on all future endeavors.
Someone asked me in a class I was teaching on Hakham Tsevi, who would you say, Rabbi Levine, who's like the 21st century analog to Hakham Tsevi? And I said, there is no analog to Hakham Tsevi.
That's the problem. That's the problem. It's the problem. And Bezrat Hashem, we should be zochet to be able to merit leaders like him soon.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Take care.